we talked a couple of months ago how it's going to be this is a transparent process. It was the most secretive behind closed doors where the committee chairs would get together, I guess, with the leadership, and they decide, and they go out and tell the conference committee what they decided. Even the conference committees were a sham. It was the worst managed legislative session I've ever seen.
Governor, of the measures in the omnibus budget bill that you vetoed, what are the most objectionable that maybe you could tick off the top 4 or 5 or a dozen or whatever? Appreciate that.
Well, I can give you the list, but the cuts to the again, the cuts to Department of Human Services funding about $18 million. They cut there. The requirement on agencies on MNLARS, so it was effectively a 3.5% cut for a lot of the agencies. I mean, I'll have to get the sheet that I forgot in my office. I got up at 3:30 this morning in Minnesota time to catch a plane, so, but we'll give it to you.
Governor, I thought the tax bill, if you didn't make the conformity changes, was going to overproduce revenue, but that didn't appear to be reflected in Commissioner Fran's estimate for next biennium.
As you may recall earlier in this session, the Department of Revenue put out a document indicating what would happen without any conformity, and so that's into the forecast. So the $329 million forecast that I talked about that's now been reduced, that takes into account whatever changes we see that will happen without any federal conformity.
What will the tax returns look like? Are they going to be the size of a phone book, as the speaker said?
Well, with all due respect to the Speaker, about 13% of Minnesotans file on paper these days, and I assure you it will not be the size of a phone book, unless it's one of those very small phone books. What will happen is we will work to update our forms, and when we talk about forms, of course, 20 years ago we talked about paper forms. Now when we talk about forms, we're talking about the electronic and paper structure for how we will file. So for the vast majority of Minnesotans who use electronic software or use a preparer who uses software, there may be some additional questions that they need to answer to make sure that they can account for the differences. One thing that will happen is because Minnesota's law currently includes things like itemized deductions, and the federal law no longer allows those itemized deductions, people will need to remember to save their receipts and their backup for those sorts of itemizations. But we will work to make this as easy as possible on Minnesota taxpayers, on their preparers, and everyone in the tax ecosystem, like the vendors.
And will there be 300,000 people paying more? That's one of the estimates I've heard.
As Commissioner Fran said, there are revenue adjustments that are in the forecast.
But how many people pay more?
I would have to get back to you because there were 2 sources of revenue that will increase. One is individual income, the other is some of the repatriation income. So I'll have to get back to you with a hard number.
No, I mean, we're not saying this is by any means ideal, and it could and should have been avoided if we had been able, again, if they had shown any interest to sit down together and negotiate on the education, emergency school aid, as well as on these tax measures. But they wanted a bill that was going to fail. They wanted a bill they could take around the state and raise all these specters with phone book, tax forms, and the like. And you know, furthermore, the legislature can come back next January. These are for income tax for the calendar 2018 that will be filed in April of next year. So, you know, they can come back and make changes, or they can do it after filing for if they want to straighten this out. I'm not saying that's a good way of approaching it, but it's not, the sky is not falling, and the extent is darkened. It's because they wanted it that way.
It's been suggested that you might consider a special session after the election, a lame duck session, to get a jump start on this tax work. Is that something you would consider?
I mean, I wouldn't. Well, I said only if it snowed in July, but it could snow in November. So that, you know, I'm open to suggestions, but I don't want to hold out that hope. I spent much of the last 2 years trying to get to a special session, and it's just been impossible. And I think there's no indication that these Republican House leaders are going to want to do anything other than what's in their own best interest. It's not in Minnesota's best interest. And, you know, this failure is their responsibility. Failure of this session, failure of these two major bills to be negotiated and agreed upon with me is their failure. And I know they won't take responsibility for it, but it's theirs.
Well, Governor, you are part of this, of course, and people outside this building, all the voters of the state, are going to see that you're leading this session with really nothing done. What do you want to tell them about that? The governor and the legislature didn't get anything done this year. Bonding bill's still out there, I get it, but.
Well, as I said before, you know, they can ascribe their responsibility. They don't have to vote for me if they. I mean, I'll take my share of the responsibility. It wasn't for lack of trying on our part. We sent 125 letters detailing our opposition to these various policy revisions. I mean, there's no excuse for a budget bill, a supplemental budget bill, be 985 pages of mostly policy, and mostly a policy that they knew I objected to. I mean, this was not about working out an agreement with me. It was about laying down a re-election template and the money to carry it out.
This looks like a failure of government, though.
It is a failure of government, you know, a failure of me and a failure of the legislature. And, you know, I mean, divided government has not worked well for Minnesota, in my judgment, over the last 8 years, but it's worked better than it did this time. And again, you have to look at what the motives were. It became clear to me as we approached the end there that reaching agreement with me was not part of their game plan.
Governor, this 989-page bill can be seen as a culmination of a fairly long-term trend that Senator Cohn, for instance, in Senate Finance, and something very similar in 2016. Are you concerned that this is becoming endemic to the legislative process at this point? How concerned are you about that, and do you see a way of turning the corner on it?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, the one subject rule in the Constitution. Somebody's going to have to challenge that and get a favorable ruling from the Supreme Court to really stop it, because as long as legislators see one advantage or another to doing it this way, they're going to do it. The things that they want to pass, the things they want signed, you know, they come separately. But, I mean, this one is just absolutely absurd and extremely irresponsible. And again, it crowded out things that should have been passed, we should have been able to agree on if that had been their objective.
Governor, you spent the better part of 3 weeks talking about how schools were going to have to make these drastic cuts if they didn't get the money. There was some money in this bill, not as much as you wanted. Are now those cuts on your shoulders?
Well, 20% of what I asked for was provided. I'll take, you know, again, we could have had the entire agreement. We should have had the entire agreement. There's no reason not to have the entire agreement. They wouldn't give up the $200 million for corporations repatriating their foreign profits. That's what it came down to in the tax bill. They wouldn't give up $200 million of tax-free money to large multinational corporations rather than provide what the students of Minnesota needed and teachers of Minnesota needed. And, you know, again, they can ascribe whatever blame, but the fact is that that was right there, that opportunity was right there, as well as the entire tax bill. And they chose to leave it in ashes.
Commissioner Bowerly, have any of the tax preparers indicated to you that they may pull out of the state because of these complications, or that they may adjust their pricing for consumers?
We have not heard that. We will be working closely as we move forward, and we have a number of tax software vendors who we certify to provide services in Minnesota each year, and we look forward to having those with us again next year.
Commissioner, I'm going to follow up on something else that you talked about earlier with regards to how much more we will be paying next year. Earlier this year, I believe it was the Revenue Department that said Minnesotans would be paying as much as $220 million more if there wasn't some sort of tax conformity. Is that number still accurate? how much more could we?
I think you'd need to show me that number because that number is not familiar to me. As I mentioned earlier, there in the forecast that was put out in February, there were forecast adjustments made. So the forecast documents reflect all of those changes, and they occur in a number of different types of income categories. So again, we can follow up with you on that in terms of what that will look like relative to current law.
And again, I'd just like to say that's the result of the federal tax law changes applied to existing Minnesota law. That's not based on the action of myself or the legislature. That's the result of the federal bill and its consequences under existing Minnesota law.
Governor, do you plan on your administration going ahead with the nitrate rule, even though it appears the committee chair is going to delay it until about a year from now?
I'm going to review that. That'll be part of what I'll announce later in the week.
What are your thoughts, Governor, on...
I'm sorry, I was thinking of sulfate. I've told the Commissioner of Agriculture he should proceed with the rulemaking. We don't believe that action is even constitutional. It's certainly ill-advised. There's different interpretations of what that law allows, but the most far-reaching would allow the Speaker and the Majority Leader any time of the year to agree and abrogate a rulemaking procedure that an agency is involved in. And that's a vast intrusion into the prerogatives of the executive branch. So we intend to proceed with rulemaking nitrates. I've told Commissioner Frederickson that's what I want him to do, and we'll see what happens as a result.
You plan on taking this to court?
I'm not taking it to court. We're just proceeding. That's somebody else's decision. But, you know, the major, I mean, he made so many changes that he had 13 different meetings around the state. We modified it considerably. You know, it's about protecting Minnesota's drinking water. I mean, we're not making this stuff up. It's about protecting the safety of Minnesotans when they turn on their faucet. And the things that we know we can do, the science says we can do. You clean it up and it has minimal impact on farmers who, and there's exceptions to be made if there are consequences that are adverse to them. It's like, you know, let's get with the modern era of knowledge about what it is that's causing these contaminations of our water supply and do something about it. And that's what this is about.
Governor, if you proceed with the rule, it's probably more likely that they would take you to court. What is your attitude on the vigorousness of the defense of this if that does indeed happen?
If somebody wants to take me to court, I'll get taken to court on a regular basis. That's why I have an attorney general.
You would.
And an excellent general counsel.
You would vigorously defend your position on this, Governor?
What's that?
You would vigorously defend your position on this?
We would say that we think it's unconstitutional and it's just a vast overreach of legislative intrusion into prerogatives assigned to the executive branch.
Any last questions on tax budget before we go to other topics?
I have a question.
I'll do two more. Yep.
This budget, this omnibus supplemental budget bill has a lot in it. A lot of people like, for example, the hotline for suicide prevention hotline money is sort of waiting to find out if they get their money to continue that hotline. I just wonder, I know you're vetoing both bills, or did. How do you address that where people are, there's some pretty important money in there for programs? I just want to ask.
I'd say the legislature mismanaged it and caused that situation. It's their responsibility with any governor to come up with a bill like that one that the governor will sign. We never had any discussions in the 3 brief meetings I had face-to-face with them in the last week about the budget matters. It was about policy. I mean, they just, and again, they didn't want a satisfactory resolution. They didn't want those things to be funded, I maintain. They wanted the impasse. They wanted it to fail. They wanted to go out and blame blame on me, everything that the people rightfully wanted and should have received. That's their failure, that's their responsibility. If they can't manage a legislative session, come to a conclusion with agreements, as we have in all the other 7 sessions, we had one that went into a shutdown, but we worked it out because that's ultimately our shared responsibility, and they didn't meet that. One more here and then.
Is it known whether the tax veto will result in a net increase in revenues, and should Democratic candidates be prepared to defend against your veto as sort of a stealth tax hike?
Well, again, Commissioner Bowerly addressed that. I don't, she can get back to you with the details and go back and review the notes, but the fact that whatever, if there are any increases on individuals, it's caused by the federal tax law changing. And we were going to try to make changes to offset that, for example, an itemization, which now, we did not change one word. We changed a word of the Minnesota tax code, not a word. So whatever increases are solely the responsibility of the federal government and their bill.
Governor, would you give this session a grade or an incomplete?
I don't do grades anymore. I think my opinion of it has been well stated.
Governor, you canceled a couple of visits to schools today. Do you plan to go out on the road and defend this action to counter whatever Republicans might be saying?
I was in Washington yesterday. I sat on the tarmac at National for 3 hours while they shut down the whole airport, and then they took us back to the gate, and the pilot said they couldn't fly because they'd gone over their time limit. And I've never seen such a mob scene at the airport because they shut everything down going out for over 3 hours. And I concluded that we're probably unlikely to be able to, that they're going to find 2 pilots hanging around and fly the plane. They did eventually, I guess, leave at 10:45, so that was 8 hours late. But I chose to stay overnight and get up early this morning and take a first flight here to be here for this, and we'll have to reschedule the fly around. It's unfortunate, but beyond our control.
Will you be taking any different message to Duluth and Dilworth than you told us today? Is there anything else you're telling?
Not essentially.
Since all our reporters need to stay home.
Well, in your case, I have to say that there'll be something really revealing in Fargo Moorhead that you and nobody would want to miss.
Governor, at first it seemed like you may take, much longer to read these bills. You noted that you had 14 days, and it certainly seemed at the time like you would take close to that. Did your timeline for deciding on these bills change, and if so, why?
Well, my staff's reviewing the bills now. I got a tremendous staff who works literally around the clock the last week and are now plowing through these bills. We want to, after what happened last year, read every word and understand what's in there and what may be buried somewhere. But I recognize people want to know and should know. So my goal, as I said, is to complete that review and make decisions and announce those decisions by the end of Friday. I can't. There are extenuating circumstances on a couple. That may be the case, but that's my goal.
Sorry, to be clear, I mean on the omnibus budget and tax bill.
No, I vetoed those this morning. Those bills are vetoed.
It seemed like you may take longer at first to review them, but you decided to veto them today.
Well, we gave them the priority, and I've had people combing through them. And I will say there was nothing in there that we found that was like last year, snuck in. There was 985 pages of stuff put in. They didn't need anything else at the end.
Did you uncover any poison pills in that review?
Just the whole bill.
Everyone good? Governor, do you anticipate on the bonding bill that, is this kind of lining up toward selective line item vetoes?
I'm not going to get into what I might or might not do. I haven't sat down with my staff to review the bonding bill. I've read through it myself, page by page, but I haven't reviewed it with them. So probably I aim for Friday to have an announcement on that bill.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.